Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. America and all the ships at sea. This is Blaine Pardoe, New York Times bestselling author and the author of the Land and Sea series, as well as the Blue Dawn series. And welcome to Writers Fix Problems. As always, I love opening the show with a review of a book, and we've got a fantastic guest today to talk about the book, The Indictment. First, I want to do a review, and then I have a ton of questions. And I really want this author to get a chance to explain this work because it's something we all need to take a look at. In terms of the review of this book, rarely have I read a book with such a bone-chilling narrative that wasn't a work of horror. The frightening part of The Indictment is that it's real. The threat of China is real. The risks to our culture, society, our nation, they're all dangerously real. Frank Gaffney does not offer his opinion of this threat. He brings the receipts in the forms of data, quotes, experts, and evidence. China has declared war on every aspect of the American way, our children, our religious institutions, our history, and our freedoms. If you believe that the threat from China is some sort of false narrative, you need to read this book. If you think you understand the complexity of China's assault against our culture, this book is actually designed to give you the big picture. Now, the mainstream media has ignored this subject or tried to serve it up to the citizens in piecemeal bits. For the first time ever, we get the entirety of the dangers all laid bare. Disregard this book at your own risk. That's my review of The Indictment, and I'd like to welcome you, Frank Gaffney, to this show. Thanks for coming on.
Blaine, thank you for that extraordinarily high praise. I appreciate being on the show as well as being able to bask in that glory. Thank you so much.
You know, the book was, my tone's a lot different. Usually I'm pretty upbeat on this show, and this book kind of took the wind out of my sails because all of the aspects you've assembled here, I've seen bits and pieces of and had discussions on the Council of Future Conflicts and other shows about, but you've really kind of assembled something that's very unique and special that I haven't seen in the world right now, which is the real threat that China poses. Before we dive into the book, I'd like you to give a chance to introduce yourself to our listeners, talk a little bit about your background, and maybe what inspired you to get into writing such an important book.
I appreciate the opportunity. The background to this is partly personal and partly a team effort, and I'll talk a little bit about both. I began my career working in the national security space for two very distinguished United States senators, one Democrat and one Republican, Scoop Jackson of Washington State, a Democrat, John Tower of Texas, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee at the time, and a Republican. And it kind of informed what I believed and practiced at the time as a kind of bipartisan approach to national security policymaking. It was taken to a new level, I believe, by the man who became president in 1980, and I had a privilege of working for from 1983 to basically the beginning of 1988, and that would be Ronald Reagan. And why that's particularly relevant, Blaine, is that Reagan came to office having explicitly sought the help of a group called the Committee on the Present Danger, of which he was a member, to formulate a different strategy towards dealing with what Reagan called his time's existential threat to freedom, the Soviet Union. One that wasn't engagement, or as we called it at the time, using a fancy French term, détente, wasn't even about containment. It explicitly sought, because it was, as he put it, an evil empire and a threat, mortal threat to the country at the time, to roll it back, to put it, he colorfully said, on the ash heap of history. And the reason this is all so important and relevant is I think we're at a similar moment today. Reagan, as I said, got this strategy from the Committee on the Present Danger, China. He went to the American people and asked for their mandate to execute it. He got it. elected overwhelmingly, and brought 33 members of the Committee on the Present Danger of China into his administration. I had the privilege of working with many of them. And when he was done, so was the Soviet Union. And flash forward to today, what we have put our mind to with a new group we call the Committee on the Present Danger of China is to formulate strategies and seek mandates from the American people to implement them. And obviously, candidates who are willing to run on that platform that will do a similar kind of takedown, for want of a better term, of our time's existential threat to freedom. And that would be the Chinese Communist Party, vastly more dangerous than the Soviet Union was in its heyday. And I can say that based on my own experience dealing with it as a deputy assistant and then assistant secretary of defense under President Reagan, with responsibility for nuclear weapons and arms control. And it will be, the nature of this conversation that the lessons I learned in that period and those that I think are so present today are informing this book, The Indictment, as are a series of some 70 or so webinars that we've conducted as a committee over the past 11 or so months. And the purpose has been to basically give the American people access to the most important insights and recommendations and policy options that this extraordinary group of people, our committee members, as well as others that we've pulled in, to help inform, just as you've said, Blaine, and I honestly, I couldn't have said it better myself. My hope has been that we would be able to equip people with a way of thinking about a complex set of facts, most of which are presented, if at all, piecemeal, to see how they come together in a grand strategy that has been designed and executed relentlessly against us for the better part of 3 decades now by what is really properly understood, not so much a political party in China, not even the government of China, which it claims to be, as much as it's a transnational criminal organization guilty of 9 charges we consider in this indictment, crimes against humanity, most especially against the people of China and those they've enslaved in Tibet and the Uyghurs in East Turkestan and Southern Mongolia and now Hong Kong. And then 8 different charges we call war crimes, because they're being brought to us by a criminal enterprise, and they call it unrestricted warfare. I'd be delighted to explore all of that with you, but that's sort of the overview of what we're about and how we got here.
I got to tell you, it was the way the book is organized is so digestible and frightening. Because as you went through it, the first part of the book, you outline these 9 indictments. I was curious if you were a lawyer by background, because these were so
legal
cases were built.
Not trained as one, no.
Okay, you really consolidated the attack on America to 9 different fronts, as I would call it, or charges against the CCP. Mm-hmm. And you started with the CCP has perpetrated crimes against its own people or its captive nations. And I've heard bits of this before, and I'm going to go through each bullet, by the way, because they were good. But I've heard about this before. But what I'm kind of curious about is why aren't the American people being presented this more often? So much of our American foreign policy is about human rights, and we hear about that, especially under a Democratic president. That's generally something that's led with. As I went through what you had documented here, it's chilling, because I think I knew that this was going on, and I wasn't as appalled as I should have been by what was going on. Why isn't the media covering that particular aspect? Because you would think this would be something that they would gyrate to heavily.
Well, therein lies a tale, as they say. I think that the reason that the media hasn't presented this information, the reason that our business community hasn't presented this information, even though some of them are, deeply involved in China and seeing firsthand some of these crimes, including slave labor, by the way. Some of them are even using slave labor. The reason that we're not hearing this from academics, we're not hearing it from Hollywood, we're not hearing it from people we have entrusted with the responsibility to represent us in government, some, yes, but mostly not, is the single most important part of the unrestricted warfare the Chinese Communist Party has waged against our country, in my opinion. And that is what they call elite capture. The practice of essentially buying or coercing or taking advantage of ideological affinity or other kinds of entrapment, sexual and the like, to achieve essentially the suborning of our business, finance, media, academic, Hollywood culture, and political elites. And they have, therefore, a vested interest in not telling the truth, not acknowledging it, certainly not ending their involvement in enabling it. And that's really, Glenn, I have to say, the reason for the indictment is we need to expose the enablers of this unrestricted warfare in our own country. We have to remove them from these kinds of positions of leadership so that we can actually understand what's been done to us, what's being done to us, what will be done to us if we persist in the kind of willful blindness these captured elites have promoted.
That's actually one of your indictments, and I want to talk a little bit more about that, but let me go through just a couple of the others here. Your second one is that the CCP is at war with America, which it is. There is a defined strategy to come at the United States. The CCP has captured America's elites and are using them to take us down almost from within. And that point, the third indictment, and you just referenced it, is really important. And the question I wanted to pose to you, and I didn't quite capture it in the book, but I think it's important to understand is, do they know they've been captured or not? Because you referenced there's a lot of the funding that goes to politicians or these elites are done through a lot of shell companies and other entities. Do they actually even know that they've been captured or that they're propped up by the Chinese government? Or is it that, yeah, I know it and I fully embrace it?
Well, I suppose you'd have to ask them. Now, they may not tell you the truth, of course, but that's a starting point. And in terms of identifying them, I'm privileged to have as a colleague a fellow, I don't know if you've interviewed him in the past, but I encourage you to do so. If not, his name is Trevor Loudon. He's from New Zealand originally, but makes his home here now, and has spent most of his life documenting this problem of enemies within. He saw his own country lost to the Marxists years ago, and he came here to try to ensure that ours would not be. And he's just done two very important multi-volume books. The first is called Security Risk Senators, in which he's established and documented assiduously that 40 out of the 100 members of the United States Senate have been captured by the Chinese Communist Party, in most cases by their ideological, front groups here, in some cases also by Islamists, but mostly, I think, the CCP, the Marxists. He's got a 6-volume, there's 2 volumes in that set, 6-volume set he calls House Un-Americans, which he's in the process of rolling out. There are 100 members of the United States House of Representatives that he characterizes as similarly captured. So when you talk about captured elites, when you talk about willful blindness, when you talk about the recognition by those involved in it. I personally believe they can't possibly know anything other than that they are now working for the Chinese Communist Party. Eric Swalwell slept with a spy. Dianne Feinstein was discovered to have had one as her, not just her driver, but her office manager for a decade. Judy Chu and as I say, many, many others have long established relationships. Joe Biden, his son, explicitly said he was taking money from Chinese intelligence. So the idea that there's some innocence here, there's some failure to really understand who these guys are, what they're asking you to do, and that you are doing it to the benefit of the Chinese Communist Party and to the detriment of our country, I just find incredible. And I don't think people should give them the benefit of the doubt. It's one of the reasons why we're preferring these charges. We want this exposed. We want the facts brought to public attention. We'll talk about prosecuting this first and foremost in the court of public opinion. The American people are entitled to know that they are being betrayed. And we are entitled, as a result, to end that practice by removing such people from positions of influence and power.
Almost to emphasize your point, and this literally, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, how much the situation is so fluid and changing. We had AOC just this last week be, placed in charge of the Communist Party in New York. And it's not, they're not hiding in some cases what their involvement is. They literally are embracing it and making it public. And I'm 60 years old. I'm from the era of where Reagan was the greatest president up until Trump's election. And I look back on that and go, if you had a member of Congress that had done that in the 1980s, they would have been run out of town on a rail. It just wouldn't have happened. But we seem to be willing to look the other way and go, well, that's not bad. That's just a different political party. I don't subscribe to that. And I think to me, that was one of the best points you made in the book. You go on as well. Point 4, you said that the CCP has waged biological warfare against America and the rest of the world. Indisputable what you presented there. The CCP is taking down our economy and our society. And I loved your tagline to that. Worse yet, we're paying for it. That was great. I was wondering if you might want to expand on that a little bit. Because I found that chapter to be absolutely riveting.
Apart from that point about the elite capture, I think this is the most important other line of attack of the Chinese Communist Party. And, it's an example of elite capture as well. Wall Street, in the persons of people like Larry Fink of BlackRock and Steve Schwartzman and Ray Dalio and Vanguard and Fidelity, have transferred, by some estimates, $3 to $6 trillion from our capital markets to Chinese front companies. And when I say front companies, that's the case whether they're state-owned enterprises or so-called private sector entities. They all work for the Chinese Communist Party. They have no choice. That's the law. The key piece of this is the individuals I've mentioned and others like them have made a fortune enriching the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese communists, of course, have been enriched beyond measure. And much of that has helped finance the unrestricted warfare against us. And also, by the way, the preparations for the perhaps next phase of this, perhaps imminent next phase of this, namely the shooting war, the buildup of their military, in other words. Most, I think, of the American investors whose money has been so deployed have no idea that they have put it to such uses. Let alone that they may not ever get it back, especially if there is a shooting war. And the indifference of the Dalios and the, Finks and so on to that possibility it seems to me speaks volumes about the degree of their complicity in this particular criminal enterprise. And I guess I would just say, this has to stop. This has to end, because we are, the famous line attributed to Lenin, I'm not sure it was his, but to the effect that the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them, has an adjunct to it in the Chinese communist case, which is the capitalists will give us the money with which we will buy the rope with which we will hang them. And especially if that money may all be lost, it is unconscionable. It is a travesty. It is a national security disaster in the making. And could I just make one other dot connecting? Because I think of this book as basically all about that. The man who made all of this possible by presiding over the completion of a negotiation in May of 2013 that allowed the Chinese Communist Party to have preferential access to our capital markets. The arrangement, negotiated under the purview of the then Vice President of the United States, a guy by the name of Joe Biden, was that the Chinese, unlike any American company, unlike any other company anywhere around the world, could get into our capital markets, into the pockets of American investors, without having to conform to our laws or our regulations, which were designed to protect those investors against, among other things, fraud. And fraud is, of course, what the Chinese Communist Party does. It's part of their transnational criminal enterprise. It's, again, outrageous, but it helps explain the point that you asked about earlier, Blaine. This president has, for 15 odd years at minimum, been actively aiding and abetting the mortal enemies of our country, the greatest existential threat to freedom we've ever faced. He has never been held accountable for it. And to the point you kind of touched on earlier, why is it that we're not actually being let in on the dirty little secret here? Well, I think it's partly because people who have been perpetrating this criminal conspiracy, this racketeering, who are accomplices to the crimes, war crimes against our country, and, well, crimes against humanity as well to some extent, they have gotten away with it and profited from it. So why would anybody allow a word to be said about it, especially when that man is no longer the vice president? He's the president of the United States. And he has populated his administration with people who are similarly captured. And he's, of course, working with those members of Congress in the Senate and the House who have been captured. In other words, we are facing a level of rot in our system, engineered by the Chinese communists with the willing help of American friends, as they call them, that has to end if we are to survive the onslaught that is underway and may well be about to get much, much worse.
I think your book is actually going to be a very important component of the upcoming presidential election, because I think a lot of what we have to take a look at is the difference between the two lead candidates, which at this point is Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Trump is, the Biden administration has taken the stance that China isn't an enemy, they're a competitor. And Trump has taken the stance of the Chinese government is a threat to the United States. And that dichotomy of positions, I think, is actually going to be a key component of what we see unfold in the next year. And that's why your book is actually going to be really important, because I think people are going to have to pick this up and read it to fully understand what is going on, because it is downright frightening what we've been seeing. So kudos to you for pulling this together.
As they say, from your lips to God's ears. And I would just say that's really the purpose of this book. As I say, I was imprinted as a very young man with this idea of Reagan crystallizing things in his time, going to the American people, explaining what was going on in the form of détente, and asking for them to essentially order a course correction. We desperately need that now. There are, I think, hopefully going to be a number of candidates who will be clear-eyed about this and offering the American people a corrective, and we must settle for nothing less.
Absolutely, I agree. And to go through some of your other points here, because I don't want to. We could spend an entire show on any one of these. It's that good. You've got in point 6, the CCP and the Allies have ravaged America's energy security. The CCP enablers are taking down the U.S. military. They're waging a divide and conquer political warfare against the United States. I'm Out of all those, the energy security piece wasn't a big surprise to me, and the fact that they're trying to take down the U.S. military, I think that in many respects that bleeds into your point 8 about the divide and conquer of the political warfare. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I've had to live through it. I had a publisher cancel me and go after me because I was too conservative, etc. And so I've been one of those frontline warriors myself. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about that divide and conquer, because I think to me, that resonated on both the personal level and something that we see in our culture everywhere.
Yeah, I think we do see it everywhere, but we don't understand its provenance. And really, this is cultural Marxism. Mao Zedong, who was the author of it and first and most glory practitioner of it, used what he called class warfare and people's war to try to defeat his enemies, the Kuomintang, the pro-Western elements in China in the revolution, and then against the Communist Party itself, his enemies in it at least, during the subsequent cultural Marxism, cultural revolution rather. This was a technique that was trained in Marxists elsewhere around the world. Those in our country have adopted it fully. It's not so much rooted in the idea of a class struggle as a race struggle, to a considerable degree these days, of their own creation. I think one of the great tragedies of modern American history was we elected in Barack Obama a man we thought, many white voters thought, was going to put race behind us once and for all. We had come so far in terms of civil rights and in terms of, genuinely adopting and implementing the famous Martin Luther King dictum of judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And lo and behold, Barack Obama and his administration, I think of this as really his third term, the Obama-Biden administration, but starting in his first and working right on through, but most especially in this one, which, as he said he would prefer to do, he's kind of sitting back, not accountable, not much in evidence, but unquestionably, I think, pulling the strings. We're into a full-fledged race against race environment, fomented and greatly intensified by critical race theory, which, as you know, is a Marxist operation. The Black Lives Matter, shock troops and Antifa. BLM, of course, its leaders profess to be trained Marxists. And so much else of this sort of clash between us, our families, trying to take those down, the whole COVID response, the idea of, economic redistribution of wealth, reparations, and all of this is designed to do as Mao did, which is to divide and conquer the targeted population. And they've made huge strides in it. I don't know of a single American that isn't aware at some level, maybe subliminal, but I think most of us pretty consciously, that our country is being taken apart by this kind of ravaging. And again, we have to recognize it and we have to stop it. and the people who are perpetrating it here in the United States, as well as fomenting it from abroad.
Yeah, these self-appointed social justice warriors just smack of China's, squads going around implementing social justice, as they used to refer to it as well. Yeah, you had a really interesting line at the end of that point, which I want to read from your book here. Welcome to Mao's cultural revolution, now being waged in America. That was a sobering line, but it really summed up the eighth point of your indictment. Point 9 is the CCP is attacking America with subversive information operations. And this is where I really thought, kudos to you and to your publisher, which I believe is Skyhorse, for doing such a good job with this book. First of all, you covered the balloon situation. And I don't think a lot of people understand that as a writer, you write a book and then there's a period of time before the book's published. And Skyhorse clearly opened this back up to you to cover the balloons. And you also covered the CCP police centers. And I'd like for you to talk about that, because I didn't realize it was as extensive as what was portrayed. And bear in mind, that was a splash in the news for one day that they busted this police center in New York. Haven't heard a thing about it since. But when I read your piece, I was like, okay, this is much more extensive. So I'd like you to kind of expand on that, if you would.
Well, thank you. Just one small corrective. I think there was a second bite on the overseas, as they call them, Chinese police service centers, when Grace Meng, a congresswoman from, I think it's Brooklyn in New York, had a fundraiser in the overseas police service center that was busted. We did have a bit of time where Skyhorse Publishing and Steve Bannon, whose imprint this is the first book of, War Room Books, were willing to allow me to make a couple of adjustments, and we were able to keep it fairly current. Look, these two things have in common this general sort of line of attack of the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against us, and that is to get right in our grill, to demonstrate their power, to demean and demoralize us by overflying our country for a week, loitering, doing figure eights so as to persist in their coverage of some of the most sensitive sites in America. And to have not just one of their so-called service centers. And by the way, the principal service that it renders, of course, all of these operations is that they enforce discipline on Chinese nationals in America, of whom there is quite a number, not just the 300,000 students, but large numbers of businessmen, and of course, the people that are now resident in this country, having gotten out of China and taken up lives here, some of them getting here illegally and so on. But what these service centers do is they will invite people, typically dissidents, people who are not conforming to the Chinese Communist Party line, in for a conversation. And what they're doing is they are putting up on the screen in the room where that's taking place a video. I think often it's live, of a loved one in China being serviced, if you will, in an actual police center or some other interrogation unit. And it's quite clear that this will go very badly for that loved one if the person in the United States doesn't do what they're told. Sometimes it's, I'm sure suborning other people, recruiting assets, propagandizing on behalf of the party. In some cases, it's having to go back to a very unattractive fate in communist China. But the point is that we were put on notice back in September of last year by a nonprofit think tank in Spain that these service centers, so-called, were operating all over the world, including at least one in the United States. The administration's FBI went in and apparently searched this particular one in New York City a month later, but did nothing about it for another 6 months or so. And it wasn't until after that one was finally rolled up that they acknowledged that there were apparently other ones operating in lots of other cities across our country. And their status is a little unclear to me. I think they may still be going. So when you look at this strategy of humiliating us, making us feel inferior, that we are the declining power, that China is the rising one, it's all part of this effort, as the ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu famously put it, it's better to win without fighting. And these various unrestricted warfare techniques, arguably with the exception of that biological warfare stuff, are all pre-kinetic, not so much but pre-kinetic. A term for, the old-fashioned kind of warfare, as I say. But we've got to be alive to all of it. And that's really the point of the book. And I can't tell you how gratifying it is, Blaine, to have somebody who is both an accomplished author in his own right, but a serious student of these matters, say, this really was helpful. It pulled together things that you hadn't quite seen in that way. I pray that will be the effect on an awful lot of other Americans. And indeed, my request is, if people will heed your encouragement to go get a copy of this book, that they'll get two, for the purposes of giving the other one to somebody who represents you and who has the power to act on the 20 recommendations that are really as important as anything else in this book. Specific, practical things that not only can be done, but must be done if we're to survive our country in the face of this unrestricted warfare threat.
Absolutely. And I am so glad you brought that up, because there are multiple parts of this book. I was only going through the first part, which is the indictment. Part 2 of the book focuses on what we must do. And it is, there's 20 very crisp, clear points of action, calls to action, I would say, for the American people in there. You really get into as well the Americans that are kind of backing or are allies in this, so to speak. And as well, what I really enjoyed, and I've been going through this, folks, when you get this book, he outlines a long list of webinars. It actually has printed in the book the QR code so you can scan and join the webinar. Right. And I've already gone through 2, okay, because I only read the book. I finished it a couple days ago in preparation for this, but I really went through it, and the webinars really dive deep into these subjects. So this book is more than just laying out, here's the problem. It's here's what we need to do to fix it. And if you want to educate yourself, and I recommend you do this, here's where you can go for more information on that. And I got to tell you, that was whoever came up with the idea of putting it in the book, brilliant, because that's the kind of stuff that really is going to help people learn more about these subjects.
Yeah. And I just have to say, as I mentioned at the beginning, had it not been for those webinars, and I've been privileged to moderate all of them and have learned myself an enormous amount from the extremely high caliber people that we've presented, this book would have been impossible, honestly. But with that help, with that feedstock of intellectual content and recommendations, it was actually, most of the heavy lifting was done by my friends. But what you've said is so true. We've tried to make the material you need to know to be not only an informed citizen, but a citizen capable of performing your duty to protect the country we love and to ensure its survival. As, again, my favorite president, my old boss, Ronald Reagan, said, if we do otherwise, if we don't recognize that it is to every generation to contend with these existential threats to freedom, to fight them, and to prevail in such a way that we can pass on to the next generation the opportunity to do the same. then we will be reduced to telling our children and our children's children what it was like to live in the United States when men were free.
It was, I got to tell you, your opening quote from Reagan in the book was just excellent. It just, and I'm going to be using it in Twitter this week because it was just, the timing's perfect, especially with all that we've seen going on. This book was fantastic, and I'm recommending anybody who's tuned into this today or who watches this show throughout the next couple of weeks, please pick this book up. It will codify some of your beliefs. It will stun and surprise you in the depth and totality that it's covered, and I think that's what really sells this book. Now, Watcher,
if I may.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I just want to say, as a decade or so long student of China and the new century of humiliation, I thank you for your service, and I actually would like to extend to you an invite to actually both of the other shows that take place on this channel, both the Privy Council and the Council on Future Conflicts. I feel that you would have a lot to add in those forums if you're willing to join us.
I'd be honored to do so.
All right, I'll reach out to you after this and make sure we've got contact information so that when we have an appropriate Chinese show, you can come in and further educate our viewers.
Terrific. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Excellent. Watcher, do we have any questions from folks who have joined us on the live feed?
There's one, while I go back and search, that I'd like for you to go ahead and clear up, Frank, because I saw what you're doing, but I want to make sure that everybody else does as well, and it's in audio format, not just a text corrective that I've sent out. You referred multiple times to unrestricted warfare, which is both an accurate descriptor of what's going on, but also could you just briefly give everybody a primer on the actual book, Unrestricted Warfare, and what it has to do with what you're talking about?
Yeah. Thank you for giving me the chance, because it's so critical. We're not projecting on the Chinese Communist Party a doctrine or a policy approach, let alone actual execution of it. They told us that was what they were going to do to us. I think it started well before 1999, but in 1999, as you know, 2 senior colonels in the Chinese Communist Party's military, and I use that formulation advisedly, the People's Liberation Army works for the Chinese Communist Party. It's why I make the point that this is not really a government so much as it is a mafia. These 2
it's not
colonels,
it's not structured as a government, is only euphemistically.
Right. These 2 colonels, who went on, by the way, both to become decorated flag officers, general officers, only got that book published because the Chinese communists approved of its publication, of course. And what it said explicitly was they would use a host of techniques to destroy the United States prior to the point at which it could do so through traditional violent means. Because back in 1999, they didn't have a prayer of having that kind of capability against the formidable United States military. So they called the book Unrestricted Warfare. The strategy the book called for is unrestricted warfare. The lines of attack that they identify in there, and I think there are over 20 of them, including, by the way, biological warfare, explicitly identified as one of the things that the Chinese Communist Party needs to use to weaken and, if possible, destroy us. All of that's in the book. So all we've really done with these webinars and with the volume that's trying to synthesize the most important points from them, we call the Indictment, is to follow what they've done, to showcase both the nature of the warfare, the line of attack, if you will, and how successfully they've prosecuted it. And I'm just enormously heartened that serious people like yourselves, who know a lot about not only these subjects, but about, how do you convey the quality and content and disparate kinds of information that we have to work with here into a manner that's accessible and usable and hopefully impactful. That's why we did it, and I'm so pleased. Thank you.
That's great. Well, Watcher, do we have any questions out there from viewers?
No, we've mostly just had people agreeing. And the one question that we did have was early on about that specifically. Hold on just a second. We have one that just came in. So Prami TV, let me go ahead and pull that up so we can actually read it. Can we talk about how much influence the CCP might have over banks, hedge funds, campaign funds, and how they use proxies so people don't know they're helping out the CCP?
I'm not sure that I know the full extent of it, but I can tell you it's extensive. Look at Silicon Valley Bank. A significant portion of the depositors who were paid cash for what they had in that bank were from China. Their businesses from China. Their businesses doing business with Silicon Valley businesses. As to the money that is being put into political purposes, one can only guess at that. It's, of course, illegal. But is it happening? Assuredly, it is. It may be that they're passing it through individuals who are of Chinese extraction, now naturalized citizens entitled to vote. And those contributions are basically pass-throughs. So I'm just saying that this is another topic that I don't feel I can adequately characterize fully, but is it a problem? Are venture capital funds, Sequoia, for example, there's an ongoing effort, or there was, I should say, an effort made by Devin Nunes after he became the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee when the House changed hands, to look into this particular venture capital firm and its China subsidiary. I think it's called Sequoia China. And interestingly enough, as part of a review of the problem that I was talking about, the amount of money American investors have mostly unwittingly put into China, Devin Nunes and his staff circulated letters asking, I think it was some 28 different questions about what is the nature of your relationship with the Chinese Communist Party and its companies. And only one company declined to respond, and that was Sequoia Capital. And by the way, one of their chief investment figures is a Chinese expat, and very highly regarded one at that in communist China. I think an advisor specifically to Xi Jinping, as a matter of fact. But they didn't answer the mail. But what they did start doing, I'm told, and this is public knowledge, is they started making campaign contributions from Sequoia Capital employees, I understand, and maybe a PAC of some kind, in Kevin McCarthy's leadership fund. Shortly thereafter, Devin Nunes left to go to work for Donald Trump, and Mike Turner became the new ranking member of the Intelligence Committee. And one of the first things he did, I'm told, is he shut down that investigation. So this is the sort of thing that I'm hopeful that the new Congress, with, among other things, a select committee focused on the threat we face from the Chinese Communist Party, will reopen those investigations and pursue them assiduously and help set the stage for the removal from positions of leadership and power in the financial sector, as in so many other areas, of those who've been captured by, as I say, our mortal enemy, the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, Frank, this has been fantastic, and I really want to thank you for your time today, and thank you mostly for the book, because it's just phenomenal. It's called The Indictment, folks. Please go buy it. Is there anything in terms of how people can connect with you, or if they want more information, what's the best way for them to engage that you want to recommend?
Sure. We've got a number of ways of doing that. I'm at Frank Gaffney, I think, on all the platforms. The websites that I commend to you are our Center for Security Policies website, a very, as a friend of mine calls, resourceful website. It's at securefreedom.org is the easiest way to remember it. I commend also where those webinars reside and so much more, a coalition we sponsor. I mentioned earlier on the Committee on the Present Danger under Reagan became the Committee on the Present Danger China. Its website is presentdangerchina.org. I also have a television program and radio show, and you can find all of those and daily commentaries that I put out at securingamerica.tv.
Fantastic. Well, Frank, thank you very much for being on the show. Thank you again for such a great book. I'm encouraging anybody who's watching the show, please pick up this book. It is bone chilling. The amount of material that's there and the depth that this book covers of the threat to the United States. Thank you all very much for joining Writers Fix Problems, and we'll talk to you again next week.
And Frank, I'm going to ask you to please stick around, and then I'm going to do the one thing Scott begs me to do. Everyone, if you like the program, please like and subscribe.
Bob, hold on just a second, please.